Thank you, David, for that introduction. By way of my background, I'm actually a philosopher by training. I trained at University of Southern California, where I received a doctorate some 20 years ago. And since then, I had an initial teaching position at Villanova in their philosophy department, and then was very pleased when a position opened at what is now Drexel College of Medicine, teaching clinical ethics. So my primary responsibilities now is teaching medical students, residents, and physicians about medical ethics. And I'm also vice chair of family medicine. But my background is in philosophy. You can see the title on the photograph here. You know, people look at that photo, like many photos, and interpret it differently as to whether or not that is a pharmaceutical rep that I'm attempting to portray or a physician. I prefer to think that that's more likely the old-time pharmaceutical rep. So what will we be doing over the next hour, hour and a half? Well, I have a few objectives. To frame physicians' interactions within the pharmaceutical industry within bioethical parameters. I'm not here to say, no way, no how, don't let them in the door. And in this regard, David and I are a little bit divergent. But I am here to talk about the basic principles of bioethics, which I'm sure are well familiar to many of you, so I'll go through them fairly quickly, and talk about how can we use them to guide us in our interactions with industry? Examine those relationships and the pervasiveness of influence or bias. And you might think that the terms influence or bias mean the same thing, but of course they don't. And I really want to separate those two things out. Are physicians influenced by pharmaceutical companies? Well, let's hope so, or those companies are wasting their money. Are they unfairly biased? Are they being given information that's wrong or incorrect? I think that has to be the focus of our ethical analysis. What is the quality of the information that they are being provided by industry representatives? So I want to make that distinction. And I want to consider a framework for collaborating effectively and ethically with the pharmaceutical industry. So we're going to sort of say, how can we take what we know about bioethics and come out the other end with something that's valuable to us, that's valuable to our patients, that's valuable to the industry in an important way as well. Of course, here we have Hippocrates from 2,400 years ago originally, and I think there he's probably writing the oath. He's writing something. I assume he's writing the Hippocratic Oath. And the basic principles of bioethics, although nowhere spelled out in Hippocrates' oath, are somewhat alluded to and have been developed to be three basic principles that found contemporary bioethics. Many of you are well familiar. Respect for persons, which is the idea that individuals should be able to make their own healthcare decisions and be informed enough to do so. Beneficence and non-maleficence, a physician's primary obligation to do good for patients and not harm patients. And of course, justice, distributing resources, whatever they are, fairly and equitably. And when distinctions are made, they're made on reasonable kinds of means. They're made in ways that are fair to everyone. Justice may seem only peripherally related, but of course it's not, because we are talking about limited resources. We are talking about drug samples. We are talking about the production of drugs. We are talking about things that take money from a larger population, and it has to be distributed smaller to individuals. The other key concept that we need to think about when we think about those three basic principles is the nature of a profession. And that's a little bit different than, when you think about other people's sorts of employment. And I'll talk about that in a second. What is a profession? Well, there's advanced training and continuing education, a well-defined role for the professional, control over admission to the profession, and of course physicians over testing, licensing, and so on, responsibility to specific individuals, in this case patients, responsibility to professional colleagues, and sometimes defining rules or ethical codes, which of course is definitely the case when we think about physicians and physicians being part of a very highly esteemed profession, irrespective of malpractice, irrespective of managed care. I think by and large still physicians are held very highly by most members of society. And of course everybody wants that to continue. And it's a matter of surprise and shock when people read in the newspapers or elsewhere that physicians are being accused of unethical behavior. Again, whether we're talking about malpractice or whether we're talking about accepting largesse from pharmaceutical companies. What are the areas of focus of the pharmaceutical-physician interaction that should give us pause when we think about physicians as professionals? Well, there are lots of them. Of course, gifts, right? Everybody thinks about pens and pizza and things that go on at your meetings, at your lunchtime conferences, at national conferences that you might attend where they have booths often. Gifts are a big part of that. And the small stuff is pens and pizza, and I'll be talking just a little bit about that. And of course, there's much larger things, many larger things as well. The small things, I think, have had a lot of emphasis in the literature. There have been lots of articles. Should we take pens? Should we take pizza? And I think some of that attention is misfocused. I think looking at pens and pizza is missing the big stuff. And I'll be talking about the big stuff in a few minutes. And pens and pizza I'm going to go through fairly fast. What are some of the other things? Drug samples. Well, physicians routinely take samples, many take samples from drug reps and use them to give to patients who either can't afford the price of the prescription themselves or patients for whom it's not clear that the drug is going to be well tolerated or efficacious. So you might start with a sample and then convert the patient over to a prescription after a short period of time when the drug is really working. So that is the argument in favor of samples. Drug companies are happy to provide samples because it channels people into their particular product line. Research relationships, I'll be talking about those in some depth, having to do with clinician investigators who are essentially working with a drug company to do research on particular substances, and that raises some really interesting ethical issues. Consultant relationships. What is it to be a consultant for a drug company? And what are the ethical issues in consulting? And of course, educational sponsorship. This lunch is not, as you know, from a drug company, but many of you have attended or will attend luncheons where the entire CME program, the continuing medical education program, is sponsored by a pharmaceutical company, or parts of it. Various symposium in a several-day-long conference would be pretty typically sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. Case number one, dining for dollars. And we're going to go through this case fairly quickly because I want to give an example of gifts, but this is, of course, a picture of the Brown Hotel. And I'm not using the Brown Hotel out of any particular reason other than it's a beautiful place. It's one of your nicer hotels, and not to say anything disparaging about it, but it would be the kind of place where you might be invited to a nice meal. You overhear your residents enthusiastically discussing an invitation they've received from Morituri Pharmaceuticals. Few people laugh. Philosophers laugh. Morituri has to do with that. They have been invited to attend an informational dinner at the English Grill, a fabulous restaurant, in the Brown Hotel, and are offered $250 for their time. What should you tell your residents? Now, David would tell them to order the Hawaiian sea bass, right? That's your recommendation. Other than guidelines on what they ought to order, what should you tell your residents? Sure, no problem. Go ahead. Have a fun evening. Well, let's think about this in a broader context. What are the marketing expenditures we're talking about? How does this affect society as a whole and our justice concerns? How does this affect our individual patients? And what does this do about patient choice? Here we have a group of pens, which I've taken off a website called No Free Lunch, which I'll talk about in a second. Pizza, and of course the pharmaceutical representative talking to the physician. The 2002, which is the most recent data I could find, marketing expenditures were estimated at about 12 to 15 billion yearly. And I've given you actually a listing of the articles I used while doing the research for this. But it's over and over and over that these numbers are repeated. They're figuring $8,000 to $15,000 per physician spent on marketing expenditures. That includes gifts, visits by drug reps, lunches, and so on. Pharma, which is the organization, it's the industry organization, has slightly different numbers, but not impressively so. Pharma is the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, and they, of course, claim that in 2003, which is a year later, members of pharma, the industry, spent $33 billion on research and development, but only $25 billion on promotion. What they're trying to show is that more of their money goes for R&D than for promotion. And I think that's good news. That's certainly the way we want it to be. But from those numbers, which are right off the pharma website, you can see that they're still spending $25 billion on promotion. It's a lot of money and quite consistent with data we have from other sources. Of that $25 billion, $16 billion is spent on office samples. And by that, they're trying to say, see, $16 billion goes to help patients, because office samples go to the neediest patients, or patients for whom we don't know that a drug will be well tolerated. But you can see there's still a little gap there of about $9 billion, which is really marketing money. So we're still talking about a nice chunk of change going for pens, going for pizza, going for CME, and some other things as well. Are these things really happening? Are physicians taking pens, pizza, CME, and so on? Well, this is a Kaiser Family Foundation study, presumably a fairly neutral study, and not all of these are. But they found in 2002 that 92% of the physicians that they surveyed, and they surveyed 2,608 physicians, so this is a pretty substantial number. This is a nice survey. They got a good response rate. 92% of physicians received free drug samples. 61% meals, tickets, or free travel. 13% received financial or in-kind benefits, and it was not at all clear what that meant. 12% of physicians received financial incentive to participate in clinical trials. And I'll be really focusing on the clinical trial issue in just a second. What is the influence of these interactions? Remember, initially I tried to draw a distinction between influence and bias. And we want to be really careful, right? We don't want to assume that all influence is bad influence. Some of it is information, some of it is education, but we do want to be careful about bias. Well, what have we seen about the influence of these interactions? Wazana has written a couple of different articles in JAMA and elsewhere, and they're listed on your bibliography, that show that, in fact, prescribing patterns are tremendously affected, and not in a tremendously positive way from our perspective, from the drug company's perspective, very positively, because what she found is that more frequent interaction with drug reps, not surprisingly, resulted in increased prescribing of the drug rep's product, irrespective of cost and irrespective of demonstrated efficacy. So those prescriptions go right up, even though the data supporting them might not be that good. The number of gifts received, and we're talking about pens, pizza, generally small things, directly correlates with the belief that seeing reps doesn't influence your prescribing. There's data that it does influence your prescribing. Again, we have to be a little critical here, because of course only the people who are, people are seeing reps because they feel that they're not being bought, so to speak. So of course they're going to believe that the gifts don't influence them. So, we want to be a little bit critical here. But it nevertheless is still very interesting. Has been repeated in other studies as well. And Trend Study, also in JAMA. JAMA has been a big publisher of these things, stimulates hospital formulary requests as well. So even when the drug rep comes to a physician who's practicing in a hospital where the drug is not stocked, what that physician then does is request that it be part of that hospital's formulary. And again, the data from the second JAMA study cited shows that that's irrespective of clear data about efficacy and issues about cost. So even if it's more expensive and the same or not even as good, the requests seem to come in after the pharmaceutical rep visits. So what do we do with this? I mentioned the No Free Lunch website. It's a wonderful website. I hope you'll take a look at it. It is by the folks who are sort of way on the edge saying, do not allow drug reps into your hospitals. And many hospitals are taking that position, and some residency programs, and I'll talk about that in a second. But this is a wonderful study that appeared in the American Journal of Medicine in 2001, and I got this slide off the No Free Lunch website. And that's the little thing in the corner says, just say no to drug reps. Principles and pens, attitudes and practices of medicine house staff toward pharmaceutical promotions. The perceived influence of pharmaceutical reps on prescribing practices. Well, they said, how much does it influence you? Only 1% said a lot. Most people said, oh, a little, or not at all. 61% said none. And then they asked them, how much do you think it influences other physicians? Other physicians? A lot. So people said 33%, or a third of the people says it influences their colleagues a lot, but it only influences them a little. Very few people thought that they were influenced a lot by drug reps. A little bit scary. It feels that people, it sort of shows that people feel that they are not influenced in the same way their colleagues might be, which is, of course, a spurious claim. The accuracy of drug information from pharmaceutical sales reps, another slide that I took from No Free Lunch. Here, again, a JAMA study, and I like this slide because it showed The inaccurate statements, there were about 11% of the statements that the pharmaceutical reps made in a wide variety of presentations were inaccurate. How many of those errors were favorable to the company's drug? 100%. And then they queried residents and asked them to recall a single inaccurate statement in the presentation they had just heard, and only a quarter of them, 26%, could recall anything. So, you know, is the wool being pulled over their eyes? Maybe. As professionals, physicians, as you know, are fiduciaries. That's part of being a professional. Other people trust that the physician will be altruistic. The physician has knowledge and expertise that others don't have. They're held to high standards of conduct. They're supposed to be objective. And they're accountable and obligated, both ethically and legally, to doing what's best for the patient, the very principles of bioethics that I talked about before. Yet when we really compare a physician versus an industry rep or a drug rep, there are tremendous differences. And I've highlighted those differences in yellow. This actually came off the AMA website. The American Medical Association has started an education program. Here's an interesting thing for you to think about. The AMA wanted to help educate physicians about the perils of dealing with drug reps. But they needed money to do that. I kid you not, $675,000 came from, I believe it was 5 different drug companies. Now, it wasn't just one drug company, you know, good news, right? But they actually got drug company money to do it. It's a very good site. It has a lot of information on it. It's got self-quizzes. I'm going to use it when I teach this fall. It's a good, solid site. But one of the days when I was on the site, I got a pop-up for a drug ad in the middle of the site. And I tried hard to capture that screen and make a slide out of it, and I couldn't capture the screen. It wouldn't let me do that for one reason or another. But I don't know how often that happens, that you get drug ad pop-ups when you're in this thing, but that was, or whether that was an anomaly, and that's why it only happened once and it won't happen again. Yeah, I have the printout if anybody wants to see it. I printed the page when I was on the page, but I kept trying to, capture the screen. Wouldn't happen. Anyway, what's the difference? Well, of course, physicians are altruistic. They have a code of conduct. They have an obligation to provide impartial medical care to benefit patients, extensive training and knowledge, objective, a lifetime commitment. Drug reps come and go, of course. Their product-specific proprietary knowledge is for profit. It's self and government regulated. Again, for profit, commercial activity. May lack or be unable to disseminate relevant scientific knowledge. We all know that. And of course, they're trained to provide specific information through promotion and advertising. Quite different. How does this generate a conflict of interest? Of course, the individual's private goals are inconsistent with his or her official responsibilities. The physician can be in a position where their obligations to their patients, or even to society at large, when we think about maintaining expenditures, can conflict with what the pharmaceutical industry wants the physician to do. And the questions I like to raise is, how likely are physicians to be influenced inappropriately or biased? What's the likelihood? How serious is the harm if they are biased? And how preventable is that harm? And I'm really here to talk about preventability of the harm. So what is No Free Lunch? The website where I've got a couple of those slides, what do they say? The patient-physician relationship is a fiduciary relationship. Everybody buys that basic premise. Physicians have obligations to be objective and fair and do what's best for their patients. Fiduciaries have an obligation to avoid conflicts of interest. Yep. Gifts from the pharmaceutical industry, whether large or small, create conflicts of interest. And that's the premise that I say, true, but is there a way, true sometimes, but is there a way that we can look at those conflicts of interest and figure out how to eliminate some and make others ethically manageable, something that can be acceptable, a way that we can work with industry to try to figure out a way that can benefit both parties. And finally, their final conclusion is, therefore, physicians should not accept any gifts from the pharmaceutical industry. And this rules out CME, this rules out pens, pencils, pizza, this rules out clinical trials. I think this would make it virtually impossible to have medicine progress the way it has over the last 25 years. I mean, we have new antibiotics, we have treatments for AIDS, we have treatments for Crohn's disease and other GI diseases. We have all kinds of things that came out of the last 25 years. And were they all manufactured and originally created, you know, in the R&D departments of drug companies? No, they weren't. NIH funded a lot of it, universities funded a lot of it, but without drug company help, I think we would be in big trouble. They're funding 2/3 of our CME, our continuing medical education. If that pipeline were to stop, I think we would be educationally in a very undesirable position. So, I don't agree with the no free lunch stance. I think that they found a problem, but I don't like their solution. And here we have, of course, Nancy Reagan with her Just Say No approach to drug abuse from years back. And the kids are all wearing T-shirts, which you can't really see, but they all say Just Say No on them, and she's very proudly standing. And of course, we all know that was a dismal failure. The Just Say No anti-drug campaign was a dismal failure. It didn't work at all. And I think the Just Say No campaign to drug reps and to pharmaceutical interaction and to CME money in medical education is also doomed to be a dismal failure. What is the effect of restrictive residency policies? Am I just talking about my own opinion? Well, as a matter of fact, I'm not. In 1992, 35% of internal medicine residency programs had restrictive policies about interactions with pharmaceutical reps. So this isn't a new idea. This is something that's been going on for a number of years. In 1998, 1999, Ferguson decided to study the effect of those policies. How did that affect people? And he interviewed 346 internists to see how they'd been affected. 83% had met with drug reps in the previous year, and 86% had received samples. Having trained in a residency with restrictive policies had no impact on whether or not they saw reps or accepted samples in practice. That Just Say No approach is not the way to go, because I don't think it's going to work. And again, Wazana, who I quoted earlier, who is a leading authority on pharmaceutical drug interactions, conflict of interest, made the following quote in one of her more recent articles, 2002, "None of these studies," meaning the study of the effect of drug company reps on prescribing behaviors, "demonstrate that practitioners should stop seeing pharmaceutical reps, but rather that their attitude toward the value of their information is more critical. It remains unclear whether it is the restricting of contact or the presence of critical faculty role models, or both, that contribute to the impact on the practicing physician." In other words, one of the most vocal critics of pharmaceutical industry and physician interaction is here saying, you know, there may be more to it than restrictive policies. We need to come up with a much broader educational approach. There are guidelines, many of you know, the AMA, PhRMA, which is the own institution itself, ACGME for graduate medical education, CME for continuing medical education for physicians, College of Physicians, and the Office of the Inspector General have all had their hand in this. And in fact, the ACCME, for those of you who are really closely involved with all this, just last month in May, made a decree that it isn't enough to just disclose the conflicts of interest. Many of you have given lectures around and you fill out a form and you say what your conflicts of interest are. That's not enough anymore. In fact, now the provider, whether that's one of these continuing medical education companies or an institution or whatever, must have a mechanism to identify and resolve all conflicts prior to the activity. That's a big change. That's saying just listing your conflicts of interest is not enough. So if we think back to the case a little bit, we can apply the guidelines that I just talked about briefly, and again, they're cited on the bibliography. And rather than pawing through each one, we can look for some common themes. What can we draw out of those guidelines so that when we talk to our residents about whether they ought to have dinner at the Brown Hotel, we have something valuable to say? Meals. All the guidelines agree meals should be modest, with valuable scientific or educational activity, in a conducive venue. That rules out Hooters. No guests, no takeout. Social activity should not compete with educational activities. Okay, well, last I checked, dinner at the Brown Hotel would probably not be thought of as a modest meal, at least not by me. It's pretty upscale, and so I would really hesitate just on that alone. Gifts must be primarily for patient benefit and primarily associated with clinical practice for the patient, not personal benefit. Item must be worth $100 or less, no cash or cash equivalent, no strings. Well, there goes the $250. And samples, this is just, they're probably not going to get any samples at the dinner, but for non-retired physicians, it's okay for personal or family use if it doesn't affect patient access. I wonder how many of you were aware of that, that it's actually okay to use your samples for your family members. And this, the guidelines agree on, which I find personally incredible. And so then I started thinking, why would that be? Why would they say it's okay to take home, blister packs of I don't know what, Bactrim or something? Why would you, when your wife has a sore throat, why would you do that? And then I started thinking that the people who are most likely to have really good health insurance for that refill or that drug the next time might very well be the family members of physicians. And they're happy if someone has a good result. That physician is then more likely to prescribe the drug for patients as well if they see it in their own family members. Just two theories. Those are anecdotal, not based on anything. So how about that dinner? And here, of course, we have a picture of Joe Castro, who is the chef at the Brown Hotel, offering up their well-known hot brown meal. I think we've nixed dinner for the residents. Let's think now about physicians. This one's called buying time. You have been invited to serve as a clinical consultant to the Morituri Pharmaceutical Company. There they are again. Morituri has invited you to an annual weekend meeting in a resort location to hear informational talks about their newest product, a drug you like and prescribe often. It's key. The letter explains that they will prepare you to serve on their speakers bureau. How about that like and prescribe often? Isn't that an amazing coincidence that they invited you when you actually prescribe that job often? Well, no, it's not a coincidence because they know exactly what you prescribe. Speakers, that's you'll be trained, will use Morituri's high-quality PowerPoint presentation and address private practices in their own geographic region. Morituri will pay speakers $1,000 per lecture, nice, and $2,500 for the training weekend. That's pretty nice, too. The Morituri rep has also asked you to collaborate on a post-marketing study, stage 4 study, by enrolling 10 patients, just 10, into a clinical trial. Each patient subject, right, and you can see there's that shift from patient to subject. Your patients are now going to be subjects, garners $2,500 from Morituri to cover study costs. And that $2,500, it doesn't go to the patient, it goes to your practice. This is a pretty typical kind of setup. This isn't something I'm making up. This is a pretty typical, David's nodding, yeah, and probably many of you could nod. This is a pretty typical approach where they're asking for a small number of patients to be enrolled in a stage 4 study. They're going to train you to be a speaker. You'll get to go around and talk about their drug. You do get paid for training. They teach you how to use their slide set. What do you do with this? What do you do with the invitation? It's pretty tempting. Would anybody not accept the invitation? Dave, a few of you. Why not? Why would you not accept this kind of invitation? Anybody want to?
Well, it's just obviously too much, and it's clear there's going to be a payback later.
Okay, so you're just suspicious about why is it so generous? What's coming down the pike later? Okay. Well, most of this is not actually prohibited. Most of this is not prohibited by the guidelines I just talked about. Probably ought to be, but it isn't. Getting trained to be a speaker, they can do that. Giving you $1,000 per lecture, they can do that. Paying you for the training weekend is a little bit more problematic. They're actually not supposed to be paying you for the training weekend, but they can have you trained in a very desirable location. I'll talk about that in a sec. What do we know about these industry-sponsored clinical research or clinical lectures that they're giving? Well, again, this has been studied. Ziegler did this in 1995, and I think it's on your bio. They looked at 1,000 Maryland internists and found out that about a third, 37%, engaged in drug company-sponsored trials or lectures. About a fifth in trials, about a quarter in lectures. So, pretty substantial number. The strongest correlation as to why people were participating in clinical trials was dissatisfaction with income. That was pretty distressing when I first read that. It looks like they're in it for the money. And I hate to think that that might be the case. But that was the only thing they found that had a real strong correlation when they surveyed physicians about why they would participate and so on. It was their own dissatisfaction with their income and that it was a valuable source of resources for the practice. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they're selfish. They want to have a practice that keeps its doors open. They may provide lots of community service. They may provide lots of free care to poor people. It's not like these physicians are the devil and they're just pocketing all this money. But their income is the main thing that they found, at least in this study. And of course, reviews have noted that the pharmacologic information is often quite inaccurate at these lectures. And how about with the consultantship? Should you accept the consultantship? And you had misgivings for good reasons. What do the guidelines say? Well, they can provide reasonable compensation to bona fide consultants. But to be a bona fide consultant, it has to have a written contract, has to be related to the consultant's expertise. So you have to be comfortable that they're considering you an expert in whatever it is they've asked you to speak about. The number of consultants has to be appropriate. They can't have 10,000 consultants spread across the U.S. on any particular, say, a drug that they're trying to roll out. The records have to be kept very clearly of the arrangements. The value and circumstances of the meetings have to be appropriate. And their reimbursement for travel and so on is acceptable, but within limited confines. They can't fly you to Japan for a weekend. Similarly, the meetings that are run need to be primarily dedicated to objective scientific activity. There has to be disclosure and resolution, not just disclosure, as I mentioned before. Faculty have to control the content of the slides and the content of the lectures. And now this is problematic. It's problematic for drug companies because the FDA have to approve their slide sets. The FDA has to approve their educational materials. So when Moratori tells you that they want you to use their slide set, they're not just being overly controlling. In part, they're required to do that. The FDA has to approve their stuff. So they're going to give you the slides. Now, you can pick and choose which ones you use, and what you say is up to you if you decide to get into these kinds of relationships. But there is a reason that they're telling you you must use their slides. And yet the guidelines say that the faculty have to control the content of slides. So that puts CME organizations and faculty members who want to speak about these things at odds with what the drug companies are required to do. So that's just something that you need to know as you go into this. Has to separate commercial activities and avoid using trade names. Do not compensate non-faculty attendees. In other words, if your spouse or someone that you want to bring is not also in the field and is not also someone whom they've targeted for education, they can't be paid to attend or have their fees paid. Support goes to the conference organizers rather than the specific individuals. And again, modest meals and an appropriate venue. And they're talking here about taking you to a resort location. What about enrolling the 10 subjects? Well, maybe you could just do that part. You won't do the lectures, but just enroll the subjects. Well, physicians who participate in industry-sponsored research need to ensure the integrity of the research and protection of the subjects, that sound medical judgment isn't being influenced by this essentially bounty, a $2,500 bonus you get for each patient. Compensation is directly related to the services performed and also proportionate. Does it really cost your practice $2,500? That there's compliance with basic ethical guidelines and adherence to funding and disclosure requirements. So this is just a slide of the Hotel del Coronado, which used to be a favorite of drug companies. This is in Southern California, and drug companies held numerous conferences, CME, speaker training was held there, and so on. It's a beautiful place. If you ever get a chance, go there, but not on a drug company. Are there questions or comments so far? And then I'll get to case 3. Yeah.
I just have a question about the research. If you're just going to enroll 10 subjects, what kind of research is that? I mean, that's not a significant number of subjects. It's not as if you're advancing medical knowledge. Right.
Generally, they would have lots of different doctors also enrolling 10 subjects at the same time. Yeah, but you are absolutely onto something, which is it isn't research at all. They want you to get 10 of your patients on this drug.
It's just an extra way for them to give you money.
It's a way for them to grease your palm, and it's a way for them to get more people on that drug. Yeah, and that's the accusation. Now you've got, your next 10 people who have diabetes, whatever it is, you're going to funnel them that way, maybe. Yeah, some comments in the back.
I had a question about the FDA approving the slides.
Yeah.
If there are errors in the slides, how can the FDA catch that? Why does the FDA approve the lectures?
I think the FDA is not great about going back to the original research and the publications and seeing how they were done and so on. I think they're basically looking to see, is it based on published research? Do you want to comment on that, David? I think they're basically not picking things up that they might the way things are compared. There are all kinds of marketing strategies where dosages are not actually not just equal, but they're not commensurate, so that somebody would be on a higher dose of one drug and a lower dose of another drug, and then you're comparing the two. The FDA doesn't pick up all that stuff. They're just looking to see, you know, were the studies carried out, are they published, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
I guess two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One was, when you broke down the advertising dollars per year,
Yeah.
there was the $9 billion
Yeah.
for this. How much was that direct to consumer advertising versus advertising to?
I don't know. I don't know the percentage. It's not very high. The bulk of the money is spent on physician advertising, but there is much more direct to consumer. That's an interesting question. Do you know anybody? I don't know off the top of my head.
Kind of the other question I had is when you're talking about how interaction with the drug representative increases your prescribing of
Yep.
particular medication. I was wondering if there's any research to look at why that happens. I mean, physicians tend to prescribe the drug that they know the most about, most comfortable with.
Sure.
And unfortunately, there's not a really great source of information that brings all this different, this unbiased, you know, first of all, there's publication bias, but unbiased information to one source for physicians. So they get a lot of their information about medications, and there's not really another source replacing that. And so how much of the prescribing bias is from comfort level versus, you know, I don't know.
Oh, absolutely.
So look at that, and if you could bring in a different source, would that take away some of that?
Oh, I think it definitely would. Oh, absolutely. As a field, there have to be other ways to get education besides attending, you know, pharmaceutical-sponsored conferences or talking one-on-one with a drug rep or in small groups with a drug rep. Yeah, I think that's definitely at the root of the problem, and that the profession as a whole has to do something about that. But you're right. I mean, a big part of this is education. You know, they're prescribing it more because now they see a drug that might work or that might be better than the last drug.
I haven't seen any bad side effects, you know. Whatever it is, that there's a comfort level because of the knowledge.
Right.
And if you could provide a better source of knowledge,
right.
You know.
Right. Yeah, I've heard some people talk medical letter being the way to go, or that there are other sorts of resources, but it's very hard to know what's biased and what's not. I mean, when the AMA website accepts money from drug companies to do their pharmaceutical industry education.
And now with registration of clinical trials, hopefully publication bias will be less.
Yes.
Nonetheless, you could even say, well, if I went through that in the time to go to all the publications,
right.
You're still having, you know, a problem.
Right, and whether individuals have sort of an obligation to self-educate that goes beyond sitting down and having pizza with a drug rep, I think that that's an important statement that the profession is going to have to say, look, you know, this isn't enough. You can't just meet with drug reps and just look at ads and flip through journals to get your education. And again, there are studies on that too, on where physicians get most of their education. And it's not real uplifting. There are a lot of physicians out there who are listening to drug reps and not doing very much more. So, yeah, David.
Well, the direct consumer advertising, the DTCA aspect of marketing, is an insidious way in which, even if you did firewalls, and didn't allow anyone in your office, and didn't allow anyone in your residency program, it's highly probable that patients will still be coming in saying, well, I've heard about there's this great drug, Bioethics, for my nasal allergies, and I really want it. And you've got to actually then counter-market the marketing that they've received from Reader's Digest or Red Book or whatever.
Yeah, TV.
Right.
You don't. Yeah, like I ask your doctor about some drug you've never heard of, and all you see is people running through a field.
They,
and you think,
changed that. When it first started with DTCA, at first they couldn't talk about medical indications.
Right.
And they couldn't talk about side effects. Now what they do is they do auctioneer side effects, where you go ahead and hear very loud, you know, very, very softly.
Yes.
And this can also go ahead and cause nausea, heartburn, sudden death, and other maladies, you know.
Right.
The problem is, though, is that they also know that direct-to-consumer advertising works very well because physicians don't want to try to
argue.
applications. They don't want to go ahead and be seen as engaging in a practice with them. For those places where they actually have, the old days, the managed care patient satisfaction surveys as tethering your salary to it, they don't want to tick off a patient. So they know that even if you're going to go ahead and lose the doc, they still have the patient. And because they've ramped it up so much in both television as well as in the print media, they have the ability to still get to them. So the point that we'll never get to a point where everybody is saying no free lunch. The real question is, how do you deal with information which is coming at you, which you know has this bias, and you need to go ahead and say, no, I don't agree with this.
Right. And I think the first task is something of what I'm doing in here, which is convincing people that, yes, there is a bias, that there really is something to be concerned about here, and that there are some solutions out there for some of the kinds of cases we're talking about. Yeah, you had a comment?
Yeah, one quick question. On the previous slide, you mentioned that finance should be arranged through the organizing committee of the conference.
Mm-hmm.
Do you make any distinction when a company is providing funds to a, say, a professional organization? They have a teaching session,
Yeah.
and then they provide dinner. And how do you judge the credibility or the reach of that organization? What do you consider a residency
Yeah.
organizing committee?
That happens all the time. Dinner symposium. You go to a conference for a professional organization, or whatever, the family medicine, or I've been to the internal medicine conferences a lot. And you go to those, and it's like a circus, and there are dinner symposia, which include presentations and dinner. I have a real problem with those when they're single-sponsored. I mean, I don't think those belong at the national conference. And just as one thing that an institution could do to help that would be to say, that a hospital could do, where we all have our academic appointments, or a medical school, would be to say, we understand that you have the need to go to the ACP meeting, the American College of Physicians, or ASIM, Society of Internal Medicine, and that's real important, but you know what? We're not going to support your airfare to go to that meeting unless everything is sponsored by multiple companies. We're not, every symposium, everything. Well, you can take drug company money, but they have to pool their money. There's not going to be any more Ciba-Geigy, well, it's an old company, but you can't go to Wyeth, you can't go to one individual sponsored symposium and have it be on our institution's dime. We're not going to do that anymore. And that's a way of forcing the CME providers to say, we're not going to have this. We're not going to have single-sponsored dinner symposia anymore. We're going to pool our drug money so that things are sponsored by multiple pharmaceutical companies.
So the money would
I don't know if it would work, but
individual corporations would still have their educational opportunities.
yes. Yeah, you don't want to drive it down so far that there's no educational opportunity, that no physicians can ever go to the American College of Physicians meeting or to the Gastroenterologist Society or whatever. You don't want to put it that low. But on the other hand, it's reasonable for the institutions, for the medical schools to say, you can go, but I don't want you exposed to all this biased literature. I don't want you to take home the message from the pharmaceutical company, which is a marketing message, not a good science method. I want you to go for the good science. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have multiple sponsors for everything at that conference, or not pay. Anyway, one proposal.
Well, one model that has been used to effect has been to go ahead and shut the sample closet permanently, and to shut the access to detailed representatives, so not bring examples anymore, but also shut their ability to come in for noon talks and that sort of thing. And say, but what we will allow you to do is this. You and the other drug companies who used to come to this office can give us a unrestricted grant.
Right.
And this unrestricted grant will then be used to bring in speakers, to buy books, to buy journals, electronic journals, in whatever way we deem appropriate.
Right.
And we will give you the opportunity then to have your name listed on the graduate program once a year, for which we are gratefully accepting this unrestricted educational gift.
Right.
And as outlandish as that may sound, that people would actually do that.
Yeah, they're doing it.
They also know that if they are firewalled, they have no access and no influence. So therefore, they will do that.
Yeah.
And it's a very powerful lever.
Yeah, because there's no choice. It's that or nothing. So. Okay, case number 3, your name in print. You agreed to serve as a clinical consultant. Presumably you thought you had the expertise to do that and could easily recruit 10 patients, and you were able somehow to get past the ethical issues that come with recruiting one's patients into a study that might or might not be particularly beneficial to that patient. And anyway, you resolved those sort of fundamental ethical issues. You were trained and you've given several presentations. You collected data on the 10 patients, and the rep has asked you to write an article for a peer-reviewed journal. That's great. Everybody needs articles from peer-reviewed journals to get promoted. It's the old, publish or perish thing in academic medicine as well as everywhere else. The representative offers to write the first draft. You, of course, will be listed as first author. Hot dog, I'm there. Well, 1996, this is already almost 10 years old, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors stated the following, and what I see, though, as I go around and talk to groups of physicians, is a lot of physicians still are not aware of this. The journals say it, it's right there, but they're not aware. Authorship requires substantial contribution to conception and design, or analysis and interpretation, and drafting or revising, and final approval of the version to be published. No more ghost authorship. And I know people have participated in this and said, oh, it's really no problem. The drug rep has the time to write it up, or the medical writer for the pharmaceutical company, and I really don't. So they're just really writing up the data that I would write up anyway. That is not true. Those articles that are ghost authored were very problematic, and I'll show you data on that in a second. And I like the phraseology in the literature. They call it the non-author author and the author non-author problem. The person who never wrote anything but gets their name on it, and of course the reverse of that. So I would urge you, when someone else offers to write the first draft, he or she who writes the first draft is the first author, no matter what. This is a way for the drug companies to not slam their name on the very top of an article that they want to see published prominently. What happens to these symposium proceedings? Exactly the issue that you're talking about, where you go to a dinner symposium and it gets written up. Articles and symposia sponsored by single drug companies were equivalent in quality and clinical relevance to articles with other sponsors. That's good. That looks great. Articles with drug company support are more likely than articles without drug company support to have outcomes favoring the drug of interest. So in other words, the science might be decent. The studies are set up really well. But the ones that make it to publication, the ones that see the light of day, that get in print, are the ones that are favorable to the product. So again, it's a catch-22 for you. You might look at the trial, you get all the information about how this funny trial with 10 patients coming out of your office is going to be done, and you're going to see they have a great draw. They have lots of doctors geographically dissimilar. They've really done some nice statistical analysis and set up a study that will have valid results, and the results will have value. So you think, okay, I'll participate on that. And then you think, a year later, where's that study? How come that study was never published? And the answer is because it's in the hands of the drug company to release the study or not. Now with the clinical trial registry that you mentioned, this will be better. This problem is going to hopefully begin to be resolved. But for right now, the data is clear that what gets published is what's favorable. Is industry-sponsored research credible? There are many articles about this. I just have a couple here. Results favoring a new therapy over a traditional one is more likely if the study is funded by that new therapy's manufacturer. And that's from the Archives of Internal Medicine. 5% of industry-sponsored drug studies of cancer drugs reach unfavorable conclusions. 39% of studies with nonprofit funding reach unfavorable conclusions. Gosh, so those pharmaceutical drugs are just so way better than the others. I mean, it's ridiculous. What we're seeing published is what's favorable. So gee, after all this, I think I'll just rely on clinical practice guidelines, right? They're objective, and they're clear, and they present a synthesis of the evidence and the recommendations. Well, and this, again, goes to your question about where are we supposed to get our information if we can't get it from the drug companies or other reliable sources that are easy to find. How objective are those clinical practice guidelines that many of us look at that are, to some extent, the gold standard? Again, a study in JAMA 2002, all clinical practice guidelines for 7 out of 10 disease states had at least one author with drug company interaction. Now again, we can distinguish between influence and interaction and bias. It doesn't necessarily mean that person was unduly biased, but there was a relationship there. So it gives us pause. We have to stop and question. 81% of the authors per guideline had interactions. 58% received financial support for research from pharmaceutical companies. 38% served as employees or consultants, and 59% had relationships with companies whose products were considered or included in the guideline they authored. Looks bad. Just the appearance of that conflict of interest should be troubling to you. Now, the flip side of that, you'd say, well, of course, these are the experts in the field. Who else are the drug companies going to call? They're going to call the big expert, the big university person. And there are a limited pool of those folks. There might be 20 or 30 people in the whole country that are the kind of experts the drug company wants. So of course they're going to ask them to do research for them, or to be consultants for them, or to do clinical consulting with them. That's real clinical consulting, where they bring them together and they ask them, what are the problems with the drugs that we market that you've seen, and what can we do to help that? But it still gives pause to even something as supposedly pure as clinical practice guidelines. On average, the authors interacted with 10 pharmaceutical companies each. It's a lot. I mean, that's good news in a way. At least they're not biased toward only one company. But it's a lot. 7% of the authors believe their relationships influenced their treatment recommendations. But again, just like the earlier study we looked at, 19% believe their co-authors were influenced. So those other guys are getting influenced, but they are not. In 42 out of 44 cases, there was no disclosure in the guidelines of the author's potential conflict of interest. So what then do we do with physicians' ethical responsibilities? Well, it stems from the fiduciary role in the patient-physician relationship, as I talked about. We obviously, as physicians, need to protect the best interests of the patient, enabling them to make informed choices and allocating resources equitably, and ensuring that industry interactions are free of the conflicts that could compromise the physician's judgment. So what are my concluding recommendations? Well, training needs to focus on changing knowledge and attitudes and skills of physicians who are the role models and residents and medical students who are in training to be our future physicians. Okay? This is going to be the same for clinical nurse practitioners, for nurses interacting with patients who might request a specific drug. That nurse needs to know how to respond to the patient marketing, the direct consumer marketing that goes on. There needs to be training programs in place, and I'm going to pass out just a little sample one in a second. There needs to be disclosure of the relationships on the physician industry guidelines, right? All these guidelines that I flipped up. The ACP, American College of Physicians, has guidelines. The AMA, the American Medical Association. Those guidelines are written by organizations who, for better or worse, take money from the pharmaceutical industry. It's not well disclosed that that's the case. There is a tiny little disclosure on the AMA website, but you really have to think about that. What does that mean? Is there an appearance of conflict of interest, or is there a real conflict of interest? And not just is there influence, but does it create bias? Is it something we need to be concerned about? The educational program, as I mentioned at the AMA, they do disclose. They do say they took $650,000 from all these different drug companies, and the drug company names are listed. But it's not clear what we're supposed to do with that. Did the drug company review the materials before the AMA put them up on their website? I mean, did they have veto power? That would give me real pause and create a real ethical issue. I just don't know, and you don't know just by looking at it. And of course, clinical practice guidelines. You need much better disclosure of the people who are writing those guidelines and any conflict of interest that might exist. And hopefully, some of them will actually stop whatever that conflict of interest is and curtail that relationship. And they're saying a 2-year window is about what it takes, about 24 months of not having a relationship with the company is sufficient to say there's no longer a conflict of interest. The clinical trials registry, as you mentioned, is a great step forward. And independent oversight, and I think that has to be on many different levels. From the professional societies, whether they're neurologists or pediatricians or whatever, for both physicians, nurses, physician's assistants, anyone that can do any kind of prescribing or guiding patients. Independent oversight from institutions. As I mentioned before, just one idea where the institution says, oh, you know, we'll pay for you to go to certain meetings, but only when those meetings are unbiased and the information you're going to be getting is funded by multiple sources. That would cut down on a lot of it. Hospital ethics committees might play a role here in determining what kind of interaction will be allowed. I hate to see that just say no, don't allow the reps in the door. That doesn't train your residents for how to deal when they get out in the real world. How are they going to deal with pharmaceutical representatives if they've never seen faculty role models interact with them in an effective and ethical way? They won't know how to do that. And you can see the studies that I talked about where they say, you know, what happened in the internal medicine residencies that had restrictive policies? Study those doctors who were then residents 5 years later, and you see it made absolutely no difference in their interaction compared with physicians who were not in programs with restrictions. So I don't think restrictions are the way to go. I think role models, I think education. It's sometimes referred to as counter-detailing, where, you know, people meet with drug reps, and then somebody from your hospital pharmacy comes in and talks about the drugs and talks about what was going on with those sales techniques and how was the data presented to make the product that's being pushed look better than the competitors, and is it really better, and what does the data really show? That kind of education will arm your residents and enable your hospital to function better, but make your residents so that when they go out into practice, whether private practice or academics, they're better prepared to do so. And of course, for you, for those of you who are interacting with patients or colleagues, ask yourself one of the litmus tests. Would you want the situation to be known by patients, colleagues, or family? It's the old front page of the New York Times test. You know, would you feel comfortable if this relationship were to come out? And there are some wonderful books. Marcia Angel's book that came out recently about drugs in the pharmaceutical industry is very interesting, and actually names individuals who have had some relationships that they shouldn't. Jerome Cassier's book Also a wonderful, wonderful book that's looking at, and Marsha Angel was editor of JAMA, Jerome Cassira, editor of New England Journal. A wonderful, wonderful book that looks at a lot of these scandals and, again, names names. So you know, think about that sort of issue. Would your management change if the incentives were different? You know, if it were a different drug company offering you that trip to, you know, the Hotel Coronado in San Diego, would you have a different approach to those 10 patients? Would you not enroll them in that study? Would patient number 8 really be someone that you would steer toward that drug? Or maybe a different drug or no drug at all? Did you disclose the conflict to the person most directly affected? Does patient number 8, as you're enrolling your 10 patients into that trial, know that your practice is getting $2,500 for every patient that you enroll? And again, if you're a nurse practitioner, a physician, you're in that role. Whether you want to be or not, suddenly you're a physician researcher with conflicting loyalties and dual responsibilities. Our activity is governed by regulations, guidelines, review. The guidelines are good, as I mentioned, but the guidelines themselves are written by organizations that get money from industry. So you want to look at them fairly carefully. And this last one's my favorite. And there it goes. Last one is absolutely my favorite. Is it wrong? That's the philosopher in me coming out. Is it wrong? I mean, I don't only behave myself because I'm worried about what will appear in the New York Times, right? You think about, is it wrong? And are you comfortable with the decision? There's a great example that I read in one of these books that said, you know, when a psychiatrist thinks about having sex with a vulnerable patient, they don't decide not to do it because it might end up in the New York Times. They decide not to do it because it's wrong. It's that same kind of measure that I want to encourage you to use. It's not just who's going to know about it, but you're going to know about it. Is it wrong? Is it something that you feel comfortable doing for yourself? Can you sleep at night? And here my last slide. It's just a physician attempting to disclose to this couple, one of whom will be in the 10, you know, subjects for the study, what exactly the study's about, why they should participate, and what his conflict of interest is, to the tune of $2,500. So with that, I'll entertain your comments and your questions and discuss. Thanks. Any comments?
I had a couple of things. One is sort of more conceptual, and then one is related, moral and political.
Okay.
The first is your initial distinction between influence and bias. Influence having an effect on it. Bias feeding bad information. And it seems to me that bias is actually an attitude. You can feed somebody good information if you change their attitude towards that information, how they use the information, then you're biasing. So take the standard, you know, presentation. Right. 89% of the statements are true, but people are more likely to like that drug. Right. Then, as a third concept involved education, if 11% of the statements I made about Aristotle were false, I wouldn't say that I was educating my students about Aristotle. Right. And so the idea that a presentation where 11%
is educational
is education seems to me false. So
that's interesting.
I guess I'm worried about, especially the bias education distinction. I think that bias is possible even where only influences occur. Sure. In a good sense of true information. Relatedly, I'm kind of worried about your argument against the just say no view. Not because I think that just saying no is the right answer, but because I think just saying no is a first step towards fundamentally changing the political.
Right. I mean, that's the argument. That's a slippery slope, and once you let them in the door, it's the camel's nose under the tent, and you're therefore swept away. I don't think you have to be.
I'm interested in the slippery slope the other way.
Okay.
Slipping in the good direction. Just saying no is the first step of activism to what I would prefer, socializing medicine, socializing the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, that's a whole. Have another hour.
But why not make that argument? Why not say, look, the number of ways that people are biased and miseducated by the pharmaceutical industry, the number of problems advertising with consumers, all this stuff. The pharmaceutical industry is a pox on our society. And
well, see, I don't agree with that. Well, I don't agree with that. I don't agree. I mean, that's a fundamental belief about, social and political philosophy. And I don't believe that. I think that, they're an industry and they have a right to make money like other industries do. But what they don't have a right to do is be dishonest in the presentation of their products. They don't have a right to intentionally mislead. And I think sometimes that's what's going on.
I guess the appeal to a right to make money, I mean, we don't say that senators have a right to make money in the process of, except for their salary. They don't have a right to make a profit by representing us.
Right.
They represent us, really. But, so...
they represent someone, but...
Right.
Not sure who.
So the issue is what kind of industry this is, not whether as business people they have a right to make money. The issue is, ought this to be the kind of industry that
doesn't make money?
Right. That is a money-making enterprise.
Sure. People draw the same arguments about hospitals and for-profit hospitals, and should there be such a beast? And,
exactly.
Yeah.
And it seems to me the answer in both cases is no. And so saying that the problem with just say no is it doesn't prepare people for in the future when all the drug reps come to their door. Well, that says something about a system where there are drug reps, where there are miseducation seminars.
Right. Different fundamental premises, I guess, about...
I think you're a defense of the fundamental premise there.
For why there should be drug companies that make a profit?
Yeah, why it's the kind of endeavor that is where profit making is an admissible motive.
All right, well... why is it okay that they make a buck? I guess without going into a longer explanation, I sort of feel like, they're independent companies. Yes, they benefit from NIH funding and university funding. But in order for them to flourish, there has to be some motive for them to exist, right? And the motive is going to be, by the shareholders, by the people who run the company, profit. To move to your model, you would have to have government-controlled or government-owned pharmaceutical companies, right? That's what you're advocating.
Oh, yeah.
And how, well, look at places where that's been tried. I mean, how would that make any progress? What would be behind the development of new drugs? Well, but, I'm sorry?
There's a lot of risk in trying to develop new drugs.
Tremendous. And the profit motive. Right.
Governments in countries that sponsor research, like the American government, the Canadian government, the Brazilian government, the Indian government, they take financial risks because that's the whole point is the social welfare of the population.
Right. See, I don't think it would work nearly as well without the profit motive. But that's just sort of a capitalist, anti-capitalist approach.
Yeah. Well, I go as far as Avery. It does seem to me that a kind of structural analysis is necessary that goes beyond the simple analysis of the problem at this superficial level. That there are conflicts of interest, yes.
Yeah.
But a more interesting question to me is, how do we stop the pharmaceuticals from putting such roadblocks in the way that adverse publicity cannot be published?
Yes.
We ran into it in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Yep.
I mean, they had to pull an article
that
showed that Synthroid was really no more effective than something that cost 1/10 the price. But they were able to stop the article.
Yeah, they were.
That's a systemic problem.
Sure.
That they use the legal process in the United States for arguably unethical reasons.
Yes.
Inducing harm to the patient population. So we need to move beyond, it seems to me, the notion of conflict of interest to talk about conflicts within the system, all the way to the top.
And control.
The FDA is both to encourage and to regulate.
Right. Which is an inherent conflict right there.
Inherent.
Yeah.
And we're not doing a very successful job, it seems to me, in changing that. So how do we get into that? How do we include that as a part of our ethical calculus?
But I don't think that doesn't directly challenge the fundamental premise about profit making in the pharmaceuticals, right? So you didn't mean to do that.
I'm just saying that if we're going to be in this capitalist system, it is a dog-eat-dog competitive market. And if we're going to allow the profit motive, then we're going to have a wealth of these problems that just continue to occur.
Sure.
Because that conflict is just built in. Now, how do we get the politicians on our side, for instance?
Yeah.
If we could resolve that, we could resolve a lot of these things. But the politicians have no will because the pharmaceuticals have them
And the AMA. I mean, the AMA is a strong lobbying group, and the AMA is accepting money from pharmaceutical industries. Sure.
The AMA is not really interested in the patient.
Well, it's physician advocacy. Right, it's a professional, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
I have a comment about medical education. I really liked your presentation. It settled something for me. I'm the vice president of a group that does philosophy and psychiatry together. And we have, as a group, not wanted to ever apply to the pharmaceutical companies. But I've been wavering over the last few years. Weakening, I think is the word. And your talk helped to bolster me back to your position, so that's good.
The dark side.
Okay.
Now, don't be hasty though, because David's unrestricted grants is a way that you might go. You know, so don't throw out the baby with the bathwater thing.
Anyway, I liked the comment about skill training.
Yeah.
Especially the importance of teaching people how to be more savvy to advertising and promotion, and I think that's a problem in general that needs to be taught, and I think it's a great thing in medical education. My question is about the strength and the promise of medical education in the face of the tremendous, powerful culture that medicine is, and the question about whether really, and how long it's going to take for medical education to make a difference, because it seems like the culture itself is so powerful, the medical culture is so powerful, that the individual is going to have a very difficult time, even with training and so on, to say, okay, well, I'm not going to be one of those people when you get out there, you know, and I just can't do it myself, and everybody else is. You know, accepting all of these things, and you know, why should I be the one?
Why should I be different? Yeah.
You know, can medical education really make the difference in this area?
Yeah, again, there's some data that shows that it can, that even short interventions make a difference in people's attitudes. The studies are not old enough to demonstrate a difference in their behavior, as the study from 1992 with the restrictive policies did. That showed the restrictive policies didn't seem to help. How about skills training? How about, you know, counter detailing, where you teach people about exactly what you're talking about? What are the sales techniques? What are the parts of a study that make a clinical study a credible, valid study with value? That you teach them how to analyze the data, that sort of stuff. And there are things out there. I'm actually about to pass out a sample of one. But there's not data on whether it really affects behavior. So I don't know what will be for medical education. I think we have to try. I don't want to sit back and do nothing. That doesn't seem right. I think restrictive policies are too far the other extreme. I mean, I think your point is well taken. You know, why should they be able to make a profit in the first place? But if you're going to say, well, they are, and they're here, and we need to do something about it, then I would say, well, move on, you know, move ahead. I don't think the day is coming anytime soon where hospitals are all non-profit, well, not even non-profit, are running away where they make absolutely no profit, where drug companies are government-owned and so on. Anyway, let me pass this out. Oh, I'm sorry, you have another question or comment?
I don't know if this is kind of a little bit off topic. Maybe not so much with pharmaceutical companies, but companies have seen situations where they become...
Same issues.
Become almost dependent on salesmen for even using the device.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if it's that just seems like when my wife went for a procedure, we had to sign a form saying the salesman might be involved in this.
Yeah. Yeah. I just took out this book because this book talks a lot about that. This is Jerome Cassira's book called On the Take. You can see I've got a lot of little pieces of paper marking things. He talks about ophthalmologists and ophthalmologists using equipment that's basically provided to them free, along with a lot of largesse when they do ophthalmologic surgery. And you don't have a choice about it. It's just, you know, which drug company or which device manufacturer has reached your ophthalmologist first and convinced him or her to use their stuff, maybe given him a trip or given them whatever. And that's the way it goes, and often patients don't even know about it. Patients aren't even told about it, that there really ought to be a choice in various medical devices and valves and various things. And the physician doesn't do that.
The physician becomes dependent upon the salesman and has
Yes.
to call them in and say, what do I do now in the middle of an operation or something?
Yeah, yeah. And there's not as good data. It's actually interesting. I was looking a little bit at medical devices, and there's some stuff in here, so I'd recommend this book. But there's very little data on medical device manufacturers and how biased their presentations are, parallel to what the kinds of thing I was showing, where there's overwhelming data demonstrating bias.
This came up at our last ethics committee.
Really?
That it's not just the pharmaceutical industry, it's actually device manufacturers and the sale of all goods. And that physicians as well as the hospital and hospital employees are marketed with a variety, a battery of goods all the time. So that it's not just one industry that needs regulation, it's all forms of product manufacturers that need to actually be regulated. Heather has a question.
Okay.
Just kind of a quick question, this last comment about the just say no take on it. Just looking at like continuing medical education, I think we kind of have to recognize we have to be gradual to decreasing the funding in the sense that I kind of see it, we've dug ourselves so far into a hole.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have a replacement for that funding.
Right, we become so dependent.
And so as we work towards decreasing this funding, I think it has to be like a gradual approach to getting them out of the funding of education, just purely education section, because we are so dependent on that money right now.
Right.
And I don't know where that money's going to come from. It's unfortunate. But finding a replacement, source of funding would be like the first step towards getting out of that.
Right. That's a good point.
Process that I don't. Unfortunately, there's not. I don't know what else that money's going to be funded.
Right. What I just passed out, I have nothing to do with specifically what I just passed out, and I did that intentionally, but what I wanted you to see is an example, somewhat randomly chosen, although I think it's a good example, of an educational program that could be used here. And hopefully all of you and David will take the lead in implementing that kind of thing here. This is a program that was actually printed in the journal Pharmacotherapy in 1996. It's been a while, and it's been around for a while, and basically the first paragraph just talks about there are lots of these programs. This is just one example. But it's a checklist, and it gives residents a little checklist for them to look at before they interact with a drug rep. What's the rep's background? How much do they really know? What products does your company have? And the rep will say. And then they say, what are you planning on talking about today? And the rep will say. And then they say, I prefer to talk about whatever, so that the physician is a little bit controlling the presentation so that it's not a runaway train presenting whatever data it is that the rep feels inclined to present. Comparison, asking direct questions. I mean, the residents need to be empowered to ask real questions. How does this drug compare with? Maybe the rep will be unwilling or unable to respond, but at least they'll have that information. The adverse effects, the counterindications, the cost, the clinical outcome studies, and so on. I think that there are educational programs like this one, and this is just an abstract of one program. Some of them are out there. You can make your own that are better than what's out there and are a good start for arming residents to deal with the pharmaceutical reps, the device manufacturers, the people who are going to be there, whether we like it or not, they're coming. On the back, there's educational modules, if you want to take a look at some others. This is different, obviously, from the bibliography I gave you. The bibliography is the data and the studies and all that kind of stuff. This is for education when you think about, okay, here's the problem, now what are we going to do about it? I hate giving lectures where there's nothing to be done about the problem. So this is at least one step in the right direction to helping people resolve the issues. Yeah.
One of the things I was interested in is the disclosure aspects of this. We were talking about it more of a writ large thing, like if there were guidelines and you have to go ahead and post, or if you write an article, then you're going to write what sort of conflicts of interest. One of the questions that I have has to do with the micro delivery of healthcare and the usage of detailed samples, or the use of medications because you've been detailed on this. Yeah. And that we don't really talk to our patients about. We don't say, I'm giving you a 14th generation cephalosporin because Bob, the detail rep, just told me about it over pizza at lunchtime. Right. And even though Pen VK would be a fine medicine just as good and would cost you approximately $4.23, this 4th generation cephalosporin, despite the small incidence of Clostridium difficile diarrhea, will go ahead and help you. Right, right. And I think you ought to, and we do this all the time. We have a drug sample closet at Iroquois Family Medicine, and we use it. And the question that I've got is, do we really tell patients, this is not the first line drug. This isn't even the second one. It's what's in the closet. It's what we got. And it may be because they're not under the safety net that we don't have a very good one of in terms of health care. And so therefore they're self-pay patients, and they would have to pay for their own statins, let's say. So you may be bouncing them from statin to statin every month depending on what we got in the closet. Or they may be going without it this month because guess what? We're out. We don't have any statins anymore, Mrs. Smith.
Right.
And so the real problem that I've got has got to do with that micro-disclosure, not a big thing. I mean, I'd love to see them in the front of a waiting room. We accept drug reps here. We take drug samples.
Right.
We may be influenced by them. Just want to let you know.
Right.
But we
but
don't.
what are patients supposed to do with that information anyway?
And the other question is, would it go ahead and pass the town hall crier
Right. I don't think
standard
so.
of,
Yeah.
would you be willing to share this?
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that most physicians would not. I mean,
Right.
quite frankly,
Right.
docs are very great about their informed consent when they just start a new antihypertensive. But to also say, not only am I going to start doing a new antihypertensive and not give you all the risks and benefits of it, but oh, by the way, I'm swayed into using this one because they had a really neat toy they gave me.
Right.
And that's part of the difficulty that I see at a practitioner level in primary care.
Yeah.
My take.
Okay.
Any other questions? David?
I'm sorry, I'm not going to go back to that.
Capitalism versus a non-capitalist society. Okay.
I'm afraid that obscured my first conceptual point, which I was hoping to address, which was the distinction between influence and bias in education. I wonder if you can say something about.
Well, I'm only trying to. I'm sorry.
How you understand? Why you understand bias out? Because it seems like bias is not in information.
Well, you know, I'm only trying to make a very broad, sort of crude distinction between being influenced by something and being unfairly or inappropriately influenced and harm coming from that to the patient. I'm not trying to draw any, you know, really subtle distinction. I'm just trying to say, look at these things. These things are different. And when you look at articles that say, are physicians influenced? My gosh, yes, they are. I say, yeah, okay, they're influenced. They're supposed to be influenced. That's why drug companies are spending their money. The real question is what is influencing them accurate? Is it valid data? Or is it studies that have been sponsored by drug companies and are suspect, but can we look a little further and say, okay, they're suspect, but are they in fact inaccurate? Or, you know, is the data there to show that we should be concerned about bias, not just influence?
But my worry is that your test, it really does matter because your test for the distinction between influence and bias presupposes that falsehood of the information really. Well,
inaccuracy. It's not all patently false, but inaccurate or presented in a way that is not 100% right on the money.
So
false comparisons, that kind of thing, and not like it's a pack of lies.
Right.
Just that it's not the whole pack. It's parts of the information, and not necessarily false information, but not all of it. You know, it's not the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It's pieces.
But your test of whether something is invidious versus legitimate is about whether the information is legitimate.
And you want to focus more on the attitude of the listener.
All these things that David was talking about, what we're all talking about in terms of how we're, not we, doctor, how physicians are affected, even when the information is all true, even when the information is good, suggests that the idea that insurers want to get their money's worth, or that they have a legitimate, physicians have a legitimate interest in learning about things, doesn't really cut it, because that even the true information can be biasing people, right? Just not in the sense of giving them bad information.
Attitudinally so.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I understand your point.
Is the distinction that you're making analogous to the distinction between persuasion and manipulation?
Yeah, could be. Could be. As I mentioned just a minute ago, I mean, I'm less concerned about false information than I am about partial information or slanted information. You know, the FDA does supervise the slides. The stuff is true. It's just not the whole story. So yeah, persuasively presented. True stuff given with a bad slant.
Propaganda.
Propaganda's not even always true, though, right?
But it can be a slanting of true information.
Yeah, but sometimes it's false information. You know? Yeah.
Presentation has to be selective.
Yeah, I was cutting and.
It's a different thing when I'm teaching Aristotle for me to walk in and say, let me tell you what Hume would say about Aristotle.
Right.
Because then you're bringing in an adverse critic of Aristotle.
Yep.
who, and as a drug rep, I would ever.
You're not going to do that.
I'm not going to bring that in.
Exactly.
I'm not going to say anything false about Aristotle, but I'm not going to bring in the strong criticism.
Right. That's a great example. So it's not the whole truth. It's true, not the whole truth. Yeah, that's a great example.
Good place to close.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.